The night Ryan Carter pulled a dying woman from the wreckage of her own ambition, he wasn't supposed to be there. He wasn't supposed to exist in her world at all. A hospital porter covered in someone else's blood, kneeling in the mud while her empire burned around them. She told him afterward that money could fix anything. He told her she was wrong. Neither of them knew that argument would cost them everything and give them back something neither had dared to want. If this story already has you, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this reaches. Now let's begin. The rain had been falling since 4 in the afternoon, and by 9 it had turned into something mean. Ryan Carter felt it the moment he stepped out of the parking structure at Mercy General. Not the light drizzle that made evenings feel cinematic, but the kind of rain that had weight to it, that soaked through a jacket in under a minute and made the world feel actively hostile. He hunched his shoulders, crossed the employee lot in long strides, and climbed into his 10-year-old Honda Civic without bothering to shake off. He was already soaked. There was no point. He sat for a moment in the driver's seat and let the engine run. The heater took about 4 minutes to actually produce warm air. He knew this the way he knew most things about his life. Through repetition, through the slow accumulation of small accommodations. The car made a sound like a coin rattling in a dryer when it idled above 40 miles per hour, so he kept it below 40. The passenger side window wouldn't fully seal in cold weather, so he kept a folded towel wedged into the gap from October through March. The back left tire lost pressure every 3 weeks, which meant he checked it every 2.5. He was 32 years old, and he had become an expert in managing small failures before they became large ones. His phone lit up on the seat beside him. A text from Mrs. Okafor, the neighbor who watched Lily on his overnight shifts. She went down around 8:30, ate most of her dinner. Wanted you to know she drew a picture of you today at school. Teacher said it was for a class project about people they admire. Thought you'd want to hear that. Ryan read it twice. He stared at the rain hitting the windshield and thought about his daughter drawing his face in a classroom, selecting him as someone worth admiring, and he felt something complicated move through his chest, pride and grief, and the particular exhaustion of a person who was trying their absolute hardest and still wasn't sure it was enough. He typed back, "Thank you. Tell her I'll see it in the morning." Then he pulled out of the lot and began the drive home. The route he took wasn't the fastest. There was a slightly more efficient path that went through the commercial district, but it passed the bar where Danny used to drink. And Ryan had learned a long time ago that proximity to certain places had a way of wearing a person down even when they had no intention of going inside. So he took the longer way, through the old industrial corridor that cut between the waterfront and the eastern edge of Millbrook Park, a stretch of road that was almost always deserted after dark. Tonight was no different. His headlights swept over empty pavement and the dark shapes of warehouses set back from the road. The rain drummed on the roof. He had the radio on low, some late-night jazz station that he'd found accidentally and never bothered to change. And the combination of the music and the rain and the heater finally beginning to work created a rare pocket of quiet that felt almost like peace. He was 3 minutes into that corridor when he saw the light. Not headlights. Something else. Orange and flickering, low to the ground but growing, positioned about 40 yards off the road to his left, where a chain-link fence separated the pavement from a construction site. Ryan slowed without fully thinking about it. He leaned forward, squinting through the rain-blurred windshield. Fire. Not a large fire, but a fire where there shouldn't be one, which was always the more concerning kind. He pulled the car onto the gravel shoulder and killed the engine. Sat for 2 seconds doing what most people did in that moment, calculating whether this was actually his problem, whether someone else would come, whether getting involved was worth the disruption. Then he got out. He grabbed his phone and his emergency kit from the trunk. The kit was something he'd started keeping 2 years ago after he watched a man collapse in a grocery store parking lot, and the first person to reach him had nothing useful in their hands. It wasn't much. Nitrile gloves, a space blanket, a basic trauma kit he'd assembled himself from supplies that weren't terribly hard to source if you worked in a hospital and paid attention. His coworkers thought it was overkill. He thought they'd never been in the wrong place at the wrong time. He crossed the road and pushed through a gap in the chain-link fence where the mesh had been pulled back from the post, probably by workers cutting across. His shoes hit muddy ground, and he moved toward the light. The construction site was midway through something large. Concrete foundations already poured, rebar jutting from the earth in clusters, a crane sitting dormant against the sky like a metal heron. There was a temporary structure near the center, some kind of site office or storage unit, and that was where the fire was. Not the structure itself, but something beside it. A vehicle. An SUV rolled onto its driver's side, the front end crumpled against a concrete barrier that shouldn't have been in its path at all. The fire was coming from the engine compartment, small but climbing. Ryan broke into a run. "Hey!" he shouted, and his voice disappeared into the rain. "Hey! Is anyone in there?" He reached the vehicle and dropped to his knees in the mud, angling his phone's flashlight through what had been the passenger window, now facing upward toward the sky. Through the cracked glass, he could see a figure. A woman, seatbelt still on, half suspended, conscious enough to be moving her head, but not enough to be moving anything else. "I see you," he said, loudly and clearly. "I'm going to get you out. Don't move your neck." She made a sound. Not words. Something between a groan and an attempt at speech. The driver's side was on the ground. He needed to reach her through the top. He found purchase on the wheel well, pulled himself up onto the side of the vehicle, and used his elbow to break the remaining glass in the window above her before reaching down. "Can you tell me your name?" "Isabella." The word came out frayed at the edges. "Isabella, I'm Ryan. I'm going to get you out before that engine gets any worse, okay? But I need you to tell me if anything feels broken. Neck, back, either leg." A pause, rain hitting the metal around him. "My shoulder," she said. "Left, and my head." Head pain or head cut? Both. He could see blood on her temple, matting into dark hair. He registered it clinically. Head wounds bled disproportionately to their severity, but until he could actually look at it, he was treating it as serious. The shoulder worried him more if it was structural. "I'm going to put one arm under your left arm from above. I need you to help me as much as you can with your right side only. Don't push with your left. Understand?" "Yes." On 3. The next 4 minutes were not clean or graceful. They never were. People who didn't work in emergency situations imagined rescue as something choreographed, but the reality was mud and dead weight and the specific awkwardness of a human body that couldn't fully help itself. She slipped once when he'd gotten her halfway through the window, and he absorbed the drop with his forearms and reset his grip without letting her fall. The fire was louder now, not catastrophic, but he could feel the heat on his left side, and that was the clock running. He got her clear of the vehicle. He didn't carry her so much as walk her right arm over his shoulder, his arm around her waist, moving backward across the muddy ground until they were a safe distance from the SUV. Then he lowered her to the ground as carefully as the mud, and the angle would allow, which was not very carefully at all, and she made a sharp sound when her left shoulder contacted the earth. "Sorry," he said. He meant it. He pulled the space blanket from his kit and draped it over her before pulling on gloves and crouching to look at her face in the beam of his phone light. She was younger than he'd expected. He'd been operating on the assumption of middle-aged based on nothing, and she was maybe 30, with sharp features and dark eyes that were tracking him with more focus than her current situation seemed to warrant. The cut on her temple was maybe 3 centimeters. It looked worse than it was, which he'd suspected. Her pupils were responsive. "You're the first person," she said. "What?" "To pull me." She seemed to be working on full sentences and finding it effortful. "I called. Before the phone broke. I called someone. They were coming, but you're the first person." "Who was coming?" "My driver, Marcus." "Were they in the vehicle with you?" "No." She closed her eyes for a half second and then opened them deliberately, fighting the pull. "I came alone. I know. I shouldn't have." "Don't worry about that right now." He checked her pulse at the wrist. Strong, slightly elevated, which under the circumstances was normal. "Did you lose consciousness at any point?" "I don't. Maybe. For a moment." "Okay." He sat back on his heels. Behind them, the SUV's engine fire had started to produce smoke. Not yet catastrophic, but moving in that direction. "Does anyone know where you are tonight?" Something passed across her face. Something he couldn't read. "No," she said quietly. "Not exactly." He called 911. The dispatcher answered on the second ring, and he gave her the location with the particular specificity of a man who'd had to give medical information under pressure before. The industrial corridor, the name of the cross street, the construction site markers he could read from where he was kneeling. He gave her the patient's status, the nature of the injuries, the fire, and was told units were 8 minutes out. He acknowledged and disconnected. Isabella was watching him. "You're not a passerby," she said. "I'm a hospital porter." She seemed to absorb this. "But the way you—" "I used to be a paramedic," he said, which was true, and which he hadn't said out loud to anyone in almost 2 years. A long time ago, before things changed. She didn't ask what things. He appreciated that. Instead, she said, "The SUV was following something in the road. An animal, I think. A dog, or... I swerved, and then the barrier was just there, and I didn't—" She stopped. Her voice had started to shake. "It doesn't matter right now. I wasn't going fast. I know, you're not badly hurt. The shoulder may be fractured, but it's not displaced. The head cut is superficial. You'll have a hell of a headache tomorrow." He paused. "You're okay." She looked at him with an expression he couldn't entirely interpret. "You sound very certain." "I've been wrong before," he said, "but not about this." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The rain continued. The SUV burned quietly behind them. Somewhere in the distance, the first siren had begun its approach. Her name was Isabella Grant. Ryan didn't know that when he was kneeling in the mud with her. He didn't know it when the ambulance arrived and the paramedics took over and he stepped back to give them room, standing in the rain with mud on his knees and blood on his gloves, in a way that must have looked alarming to the police officer who approached him first. He answered questions. He gave his name and his phone number and his employee ID from Mercy General, which seemed to satisfy them. He described what he'd seen. He gave his account of her condition and her statements and the timeline of events with the methodical accuracy of someone trained to retain detail in stressful situations. The officer wrote it all down. At some point during all this, a black Mercedes arrived. A large man got out. Mid-40s, professional posture, moving with the controlled urgency of someone who had been managing crises for a long time. He identified himself to the officer as Marcus Webb, Ms., Grant's personal driver and security detail. His eyes swept the scene and landed briefly on Ryan before moving to the ambulance. Ryan watched the stretcher being loaded and thought about Lily drawing his face in a classroom and decided he wanted to go home. He retrieved his kit from where he'd left it near the fence, walked back to his car, and drove the rest of the way home in wet clothes with the heater up all the way. He told Mrs. Okafor what had happened when he got in the abbreviated way he told most stories. "Something happened on the way home. A vehicle accident. He helped. It's fine." She looked at his clothes and raised her eyebrows and said nothing, which was one of the things he genuinely appreciated about her. After she left, he showered and stood in the kitchen and ate cold rice and beans standing over the sink because he was too tired to sit down, and then he checked on Lily. She was asleep on her side with one arm thrown over the edge of the mattress and her mouth opened slightly, the blanket pushed down to her waist the way it always was by the time he checked, no matter how carefully he'd tucked her in. He pulled it back up. She stirred without waking. On her small desk was a piece of construction paper, red and yellow crayon, a figure with brown hair and a face drawn with the careful imprecision of a 6-year-old who was concentrating very hard. Underneath it, in her neat block letter printing, "My dad is my hero." He stood there for a while. Then he went to bed. 2 days later, a call came to the hospital. Ryan was in the middle of a linen transport, 3rd floor to 6th, which involved a specific sequence of elevator and corridor navigation that he'd gotten efficient at, when his supervisor, a permanently frazzled man named Gerald, appeared at the end of the hall and told him there was someone asking for him at the front reception. "Asking for me by name?" "By name and employee number," Gerald said, "which is weird, right?" It was weird. Ryan finished the transport, washed his hands, and went down to the lobby. The man from the construction site, Marcus, was standing near the entrance in a suit that had not been bought off any rack Ryan had ever visited. He had a quality of stillness that Ryan associated with people who had spent significant time in either the military or personal security, and the way he tracked Ryan across the lobby suggested it was the latter. "Mr. Carter," he extended a hand. "Marcus Webb. We met briefly the other night." "I remember." Ryan shook it. "How is she?" "Ms. Grant is recovering well. The shoulder was a fracture, as you suspected. She has a concussion, but the scans came back clean." A pause. "She wanted to thank you in person. She asked if you'd be willing to come to her home this evening." Ryan had been expecting something like this. He'd thought about how he'd respond, and he thought he'd been clear in his own head. But standing here in the lobby with the request actually in front of him, he found himself pausing. "Tell her I'm glad she's okay," he said. "She doesn't owe me anything." Marcus's expression didn't change. "She'd like to say that herself." "She can say it to you and you can relay it." A beat of silence. "Mr. Carter, Ms. Grant doesn't typically take no for an answer." "Most people I've met who don't take no for an answer have never had someone say it to them with any conviction," Ryan said. "I'm glad she's okay. That's the whole thing." Marcus looked at him for a moment with something that might have been assessment. "She'll ask again," he said. "That's her right." Ryan nodded once. "Have a good evening." He went back to work. "What?" she did ask again. 3 days after that, a card arrived at the hospital, addressed to him personally. Cream-colored envelope, his name in actual handwriting. He opened it in the break room, standing at the counter with a cup of coffee that had been sitting since someone else made it 40 minutes ago. "Mr. Carter, I'm not very good at being in someone's debt. My assistant says this makes me difficult to work with. She's probably right. I would like to meet you and thank you properly, not because I think it erases what you did, but because I don't know what else to do with the fact that you pulled me out of that car. If you're willing, name the time and place. Isabella Grant." His co-worker. Priya came into the break room while he was reading it. "What's that?" "A thank you note." "From who?" "A patient." She peered at the envelope. "That's very fancy stationery for a patient." He folded the card and put it in his pocket. The place he named was a diner on the east side called Farley's, the kind of place that had been there since 1987 and would probably outlast every trend and economic disruption until the building itself gave up. He came directly from a shift, still in his scrubs, at 10 in the morning on a Tuesday when the lunch crowd hadn't arrived yet, and the booths were half empty. He was 5 minutes early. He ordered coffee and waited. She arrived at exactly 10, which he respected, with Marcus positioned near the door in a way that was professional enough to be unobtrusive and obvious enough to be clear. She was in jeans and a dark coat, left arm in a sling, a small bruise still yellowing along her hairline. She looked different without the mud and the rain and the emergency, sharper, more composed, and at the same time somehow more fragile, the way people looked when they were holding themselves together with some effort. She slid into the booth across from him and looked at him directly. "You look exactly how I remembered," she said, which surprised me. "Were you expecting someone different?" "I wasn't sure I'd actually remember your face. I had a concussion." She glanced at the sling. "I keep forgetting I can't use this hand and then trying to use it." "How long did they say?" 6 to 8 weeks. They say I need to rest." She said the word rest the way some people said root canal. "I have never rested in my adult life." "That may be part of the problem." She looked at him. "I don't mean the accident," he said. "Just generally." She was quiet for a moment, then, "You didn't want to come." "No." "Why did you?" He considered the question honestly. "Because the letter was decent. It didn't feel like a transaction." "Everything I do is usually a transaction," she said. "My CFO would be alarmed to hear me admit that." The waitress came. Isabella ordered black coffee. Ryan asked for a refill. They sat with a small silence that wasn't entirely uncomfortable. "I looked you up," she said. He'd assumed as much. "And?" "You were a paramedic with Metro EMS for 6 years. Above average response record. You left 2 years ago." She paused. "I couldn't find a reason for the departure, and I don't usually not find things." "That's because there's no paperwork for the reasons I left," he said. She didn't push, which surprised him. Instead, she said, I want to help you. I want to offer you something meaningful. A position, funding for training if you want to go back into medicine, college accounts for your daughter if finances are a concern. Whatever would actually make a difference in your life. She said it plainly, without performance. I know you're not looking for a reward. I'm not offering it as a reward. I'm offering it because I have significant resources, and you did something important, and it seems wasteful not to use those resources for something that matters. He listened to all of this. That's a very logical argument, he said. I am a very logical person. I know. He wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. And I don't need any of it. Ryan, I'm not being proud, he said. I want to be clear about that because I think that's how it might look. My daughter has what she needs. My job is stable. I have a plan. He looked at her directly. What you're describing isn't help. It's you trying to restore a balance that doesn't need restoring. You don't owe me. The world isn't a ledger. Something moved across her face. Not offense. Something less comfortable than offense. My entire career is built on the idea that problems can be solved with the right resources, she said. Some problems can be. Most problems. What about the ones that can't? She didn't answer right away. I don't spend much time on those, she said finally. I'm not sure that's wisdom or avoidance. Probably both, he said. It usually is. She looked at him with an expression he was starting to recognize. A woman who was used to having the next thing to say already prepared, finding herself without it. The coffee came. They drank it. After a while, she said, I was at that construction site because it's going to be a community health center, or it's supposed to be. Grant Foundation project. I was visiting the site alone because I needed to think about whether I actually believed in it or whether I was doing it for the tax structure. He hadn't expected that. And, he said, and then I drove into a concrete barrier and a hospital porter pulled me out of a burning car and I haven't stopped thinking about the question since. He nodded slowly. That sounds like an answer to me, he said. It doesn't feel like one. Those are usually the real ones. She turned her coffee cup in her good hand. The diner hummed around them. The quiet domestic percussion of ordinary morning, plates and conversation, and someone's phone playing something tinny in a back booth. Can I ask you something? She said. Sure. Why did you stop being a paramedic? He'd known the question was coming. He'd decided before he arrived that he'd answer it honestly because dishonest answers to direct questions were exhausting and she'd struck him as someone who would notice anyway. My daughter's mother left when Lily was 8 months old, he said. Not dramatically. She just wasn't built for the life. That's not a criticism. Some people aren't. She said she needed to leave and she left, and Lily stayed with me. He paused. Paramedic shifts are 24 on, 48 off. That schedule works for a lot of people, but it doesn't work when you're a single parent of an infant and your support system is essentially one neighbor and a lot of caffeine. I held on for about a year. Then I did the math, and I made the call. She was listening without interrupting, which he noticed. The hospital porter work is nights only, 6 to midnight. Mrs. Okafor from next door watches Lily. I'm home by 12:30 and she's asleep and I'm there every morning when she wakes up. He shrugged. It's not what I trained for, but it works. Do you miss it? Every shift, he said. But that's not the same thing as regretting it. She looked at him for a long moment. I don't have children. I've always thought I'd figure that out later, and then later keeps moving. You're 30. How do you... She stopped. Right. You looked me up too. I looked you up after your driver came to the hospital, he said. I wanted to know who I'd helped. And? He hesitated, chose honesty again. I thought you were going to be someone different. What kind of different? More polished, more managed. He gestured vaguely. The press coverage is all edge, Forbes profile, the IPO, the way other executives talk about you. He paused. You're harder to read in person. I mean that as a compliment. I've never been called hard to read as a compliment before. Predictable people are dull to save, he said. She laughed, a sudden, real sound, short and surprised, and then she pressed her good hand over her mouth like she hadn't intended it. And he thought that was the most human thing he'd seen from her yet. He made it home by 11:15. Lily was still at school. He had 3 hours before pickup, and he spent 40 minutes of them on the couch not sleeping, staring at the ceiling, replaying the conversation in the diner with the particular involuntary focus that his brain applied to things it wasn't finished processing. She was not what he'd expected. He'd expected entitlement or performance, or the glossy condescension of someone who believed that money had made them more intelligent. She had none of those things, or had them so buried under something more complicated that they weren't visible yet. What she had was a kind of controlled restlessness, the particular energy of a person who moved very fast through the world and had recently been forced to stop and was finding the stillness genuinely disorienting. He understood that. He understood it more than he'd wanted to admit sitting across from her. He'd moved very fast for 6 years too. And then Lily had arrived and the speed became impossible, and he'd learned to be still instead, and the stillness had taken 2 years to stop feeling like surrender and start feeling like something else. He didn't know what to call what it felt like now. His phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "This is Isabella. Marcus gave me your number without my asking, which means he thinks I need it. He's usually right about that kind of thing. I wanted to say..." The conversation was the most normal one I've had in 3 years. "I don't know what to do with that either. IG." He read it twice. Then he typed back, "The coffee was better than average for a place that old. High recommendation." 3 dots appeared, then, "That's a low bar. Most good things clear a low bar and get dismissed for it," he typed. "Good night, Ms. Grant." A pause, then, "Good night, Ryan." He put his phone face down on the couch and looked at the ceiling for a while longer. In the kitchen, on the counter, Lily's drawing was held to the refrigerator by a magnet shaped like a crab that they'd gotten at the waterfront market last summer. The figure in crayon, brown hair, slightly lopsided smile, the careful effort of a 6-year-old's love made visible in red and yellow wax. He thought about a construction site that was supposed to become a health center. He thought about a woman asking herself in a storm whether she believed in what she was building. He thought about how some questions didn't have clean answers, and how that was usually where the real work began. Then he got up and started making dinner, because Lily would be home in 2 hours and she liked it when he cooked, even when what he cooked was simple, and simplicity had never once felt like failure to him. That, at least, was something he knew for certain. The texts didn't stop after that night. Ryan hadn't expected them to exactly, but he also hadn't planned for them. They arrived in the irregular pattern of someone who didn't have a consistent schedule, sometimes at 7 in the morning, sometimes past midnight, occasionally in the middle of what he assumed were meetings because they were always short and slightly abrupt, like thoughts she'd had and sent before she could reconsider. The contractor for the health center site is 6 weeks behind. I've been told this is normal. I find it unreasonable. Lily. That's an unusual name. Where did it come from? I had a meeting today where 3 people told me the same thing in 3 different ways, hoping I'd agree with one of them. I didn't. He responded when he had time, which wasn't always immediately. He was in the middle of a night shift when her second message arrived, and he didn't see it until he was driving home at 12:40, sitting at a red light in the rain. It had rained every day that week, which felt either meaningful or like October in a coastal city, probably the latter. Her grandmother's name, he typed back at the red light, which he knew you weren't supposed to do. She never met her. It felt like a way to give her something. He sent it and put the phone down. By the time he got home, there was a response. That's a good reason for a name. He didn't reply to that one. Some things didn't need a reply. He'd learned that distinction slowly, over years of being in situations where the impulse to fill silence with words had caused more damage than the silence itself. It was Lily who changed things, though not in any way Ryan had anticipated or could have predicted. He picked her up from school on a Thursday afternoon, one of his days off, which he tried to make count by actually being present rather than running errands while she was nearby, a distinction that took conscious effort. And she was in the back seat eating the half a peanut butter sandwich she always saved from lunch when she said, out of nowhere, "Dad, what's a billionaire?" He glanced in the rearview mirror. "Where'd you hear that word?" Caden at school said his dad works for a billionaire. He said they have 3 houses. She took a measured bite of sandwich. Do they sleep in a different house every night, like rotating? Probably not every night. Then what's the point of 3 houses? He thought about it. Some people measure success by accumulating things. It makes them feel safe. She considered this with the patient seriousness she brought to most conceptual problems. But you can only sleep in one house at a time. That's correct. So it's like having 3 lunches and only eating one. That's actually a reasonable analogy, yeah. That seems wasteful. Some people would agree with you. She finished the sandwich and looked out the window at the passing street. Do we have enough houses? We have exactly 1 house, he said, which is the right amount. Okay. She seemed satisfied. Can we get a fish? He mentioned this conversation almost accidentally in a text to Isabella 3 days later. He'd been telling her about Lily's general approach to logical problems because she'd asked what Lily was like, and he'd found that easier to answer through examples than description. She's 6 and she already thinks billionaires are wasteful, Isabella replied. She's right. I have 2 apartments and I've slept in the second one 4 times. Why do you have it? I bought it during a period when I was making decisions with my net worth instead of my judgment. It happens more than people admit. He read that and thought about what it cost her to type it. Not the admission itself, but the precision of it. The self-awareness without self-congratulation. That was harder than it looked. That's an honest answer, he wrote back. I've been trying that lately. It's exhausting. It gets easier. Does it? He thought for a moment. No, he typed. But you get better at tolerating the exhaustion. 3 dots. Then, that's not the encouragement I was looking for. I know, he replied, but it's what I've got. She called him the following Tuesday. Not a text, an actual call, which felt like a shift in register, the way conversations sometimes graduated from one medium to another when they'd built enough weight to need a real voice. He was making dinner. Lily was in the living room with a coloring book, loudly narrating a story she was apparently creating in real time about a dragon who worked at a library. Ryan answered the phone with one hand and kept stirring with the other. Is this a bad time? Isabella asked. It's fine. What's wrong? A pause. Why do you assume something's wrong? Because you called instead of texted. Another pause, this one with a different quality. The contractor pulled out. The health center site. Her voice was flat in a way that was clearly covering something harder. He cited permit complications, which is partly true and partly there are investors in the surrounding development who would prefer the site stay commercial. They've been applying pressure. Ryan turned the burner down. Can you fight it? I'm fighting everything simultaneously right now. My board wants me to pause the foundation projects until the Q4 numbers stabilize. My legal team says the permit issue is resolvable, but it'll take 8 to 12 weeks. And the community groups who are counting on that center have been waiting 2 years already. She stopped. I don't know why I'm telling you this. Because you need to say it out loud to someone who isn't on your payroll. Silence. That's a specific reason, she said. You have a lot of people around you who are paid to manage your decisions. That's different from having someone you can actually think at. Think at, she repeated. Is that what this is? I don't know what this is, he said honestly. In the living room, Lily had elevated the Dragon's Library story to involve what sounded like a legal dispute over overdue book fines. But if it helps, keep doing it. She let out a breath. Not quite a sigh. Something more controlled. I'm going to fight the permit issue. The board can wait. The Q4 numbers will be what they are. That sounds right. It might cost me votes at the next board meeting. What's more important to you? A longer pause this time. The center, obviously. Then you already know what to do. I knew what to do before I called you, she said. I know that's not why you called. She was quiet for a moment. Then, in a slightly different tone, what is Lily narrating? I can hear her from here. A dragon who apparently got into a legal dispute with a public library over late fees. A beat. Then, is the dragon winning? He listened. Hard to say. There's been a motion to dismiss. She seems passionate about due process. Isabella laughed again. That same sudden, genuine sound from the diner, and he thought it was probably the kind of laugh that escaped her rather than one she produced. She sounds like someone I'd hire. She's 6. I'll put her on retainer for 2031. He smiled at the stove, caught himself, kept stirring. The offer that fractured things came 3 weeks after that call. It arrived through Marcus, which Ryan later thought was intentional. Not cowardly exactly, but calibrated. Isabella was careful about how she presented things. She'd sent Marcus with formal offers twice before. Both times Ryan had declined. Both times she'd accepted the refusal with something that looked like patience and probably wasn't. This time was different. Marcus arrived at the hospital on a Wednesday morning, and this time there was a folder. Ryan looked at the folder the way you looked at something you already knew the contents of before opening. They were standing in the break room. Gerald had given them 5 minutes with the practiced wariness of a supervisor who didn't understand what was happening but recognized that it was above his pay grade. "She's offering a position," Marcus said. "Community Health Liaison, Grant Foundation, part-time initially, 20 hours a week. The role would involve working with the health center project directly, doing outreach to local hospitals and emergency services to establish community partnerships." He placed the folder on the table. "The salary is 2.5 times your current income, benefits at executive level, flexible scheduling around your daughter's school hours." Ryan didn't touch the folder. "She designed the schedule around Lily," Marcus added. "I know," Ryan said. "That's the part she thought would work." Marcus looked at him with that quality of professional neutrality that Ryan had come to understand was not indifference, but restraint. "Is it working?" Ryan pulled a chair out from the table and sat. He looked at the folder for a moment. Then he said, "Tell me something. How long have you worked for her?" 7 years. "And in 7 years, has she ever designed something around someone else's life?" Marcus was quiet for a beat. "No." "That's what makes this hard," Ryan said. "Is that a no?" He let out a breath and pressed his fingers into the edge of the table. The thing about the offer wasn't the money, though the money was significant enough to be genuinely disorienting when he did the math. The thing was that it was the right job. It was work he'd be good at, work that connected to something he'd lost when he left the ambulance. The specific satisfaction of being useful to people in a way that actually mattered, not just moving linen from one floor to another. That was the trap. It wasn't insulting or condescending or transactional. It was thoughtful, carefully constructed, and it used the knowledge he'd gathered about who he was and what he'd given up and what he might want. It was the most sophisticated offer he'd ever been made, and he still didn't know whether to take it. "Tell her I need a week," he said. Marcus nodded and picked up the folder. "She'll say that means you're considering it." "She's right," Ryan said. "That's what it means." The week was not restful. He ran the numbers, which was straightforward. He thought about Lily's college fund, which currently contained enough for approximately 1 semester at a state school if nothing in the market changed dramatically. He thought about his car and its rattling coin noise, and the tire and the window towel, and the small inventory of managed failures that he'd built his stability on. He thought about the job itself, what it would actually require of him, what he'd be walking back into emotionally, whether he was ready for that. And he thought about Isabella. Not romantically, or not entirely, or not in any way he was willing to examine directly, but the thought was there and it was relevant, and ignoring it would have been its own kind of dishonesty. He called his sister Claire. She lived in Portland, and they talked every few weeks, long calls that covered everything and resolved nothing in particular. He told her the rough shape of the situation without many specifics. "Is she paying you because she wants to, or because she feels guilty?" Claire asked. "I think she's paying me because she thinks it'll make things even. And you don't want things even. I don't think things being even is the point." "What is the point?" He sat on the back step of the house, which was just concrete and a small square of weedy grass but had a sight line to the neighbor's oak tree that he liked. Lily was asleep. The night was cold and clear. "I think she's trying to solve a problem that isn't a transaction," he said, "and I think if I take the job under those terms, it confirms for her that everything can be resolved with the right offer, and I don't think that's good for her." Claire was quiet for a moment. "That's a very generous interpretation of why you won't take a well-paying job." "It's not the only interpretation." "What's the other one?" He watched the oak tree. "That it's easier to keep my life the shape it is." "And which one is true?" "Probably both. They usually are." She made a sound that was specifically the sound of an older sister not saying the obvious thing. Then, "Ryan, do you like her?" She's interesting. That's not an answer. I know. He pulled his jacket tighter. I don't know her well enough to know what I think. And the job would change that one way or the other. That's called a risk. I'm aware. You've been avoiding those. I've been managing them. Same thing in different clothes, Claire said. He called Isabella directly, which was also a shift in register. She answered on the second ring. There was background noise. He could hear the specific ambient sound of a large office space, and then it cut off, as though she'd stepped somewhere quieter. You could have just texted, she said. I wanted to ask you something, and I needed to hear your voice when you answered. A brief silence. That's a very particular thing to say. Did you design the schedule around Lily? She didn't hesitate. Yes. Why? Because it's relevant information for a working parent considering a position. That's the rational answer. It's also the true one. Isabella. He stopped, found the question underneath the question. What are you actually trying to do here? She was quiet for long enough that he thought she might not answer. I'm trying to do something that has actual value, she said finally. The health center, the community partnerships. I've been building things for 6 years that make money, and I'm good at it, and it means almost nothing to me on any given Tuesday. Her voice was careful, measured, controlled. You do a job that you trained for years to do, that you're clearly still equipped for, and you're moving linen at midnight because the math worked out better that way. That seems like a loss. For you, and for anyone who might have benefited from what you actually know how to do. You're not responsible for much. I know I'm not responsible. That's not the point. She paused. You said the world isn't a ledger. Fine. Then this isn't about debt. I'm asking you to take a job that you'd be good at, that would help people, and that would pay you fairly. The fact that I'm the one offering it is incidental. He sat with that. Is it? He said. The line was quiet. No, she admitted. Probably not entirely. That's the honest answer. You said honesty gets easier. I said you get better at tolerating it, he corrected. She made a sound, half laugh, half something else. The offer stands for another 2 weeks. After that, the foundation's HR process requires it to go to open posting. A pause. For what it's worth, I don't want to post it openly. I want you to take it. I know, he said. I'll let you know. Before the 2 weeks. Before the 2 weeks, he agreed. He took Lily to the waterfront on Saturday morning, which was something they did when the weather allowed. Walked the boardwalk, watched the water, occasionally fed the pigeons despite the signs asking people not to, which Lily considered a personal injustice she would not be complying with. She had a bag of torn bread and was distributing it with the careful equity of a small person who believed all birds deserved equal access to resources. Dad, she said, without looking up from her pigeon diplomacy. Are you happy? He looked down at her. She was still focused on the pigeons, which was the kind of question asking he'd noticed she did. She asked the important ones while appearing to look at something else, as though giving him room to answer without the pressure of eye contact. Most of the time, he said. What about the other times? The other times, I'm just tired. She considered this. Mrs. Okafor says you work very hard. Mrs. Okafor is right. She also says you don't ask for help much. Ryan looked at his daughter, who was 6 years old and apparently collecting opinions about him from neighboring adults. Does she? She said it like it was a problem. Lily finally looked up at him with the direct, unguarded attention that only small children and very honest adults could sustain without it feeling aggressive. Is it a problem? It can be, he said carefully. Sometimes. She looked at him for another moment. Then she looked back at the pigeons. I think you should ask for more help, she said, with the simplicity of a person who had not yet learned that simplicity was hard. Do you? Yes. She threw a handful of bread. Also, I still want a fish. We're not getting a fish. Yet, she said. We're not getting one yet. He stood there on the boardwalk with the cold sea wind on his face and his daughter negotiating with pigeons and thought about an offer sitting on a table he hadn't yet walked back to. He thought about Isabella saying, I want you to take it, and the specific quality of that sentence, Not demanding, not transactional, just honest about wanting something without fully understanding why. He thought about how he'd left a profession he loved because the math required it, and how the math had been right, and how the math being right hadn't made the leaving not cost anything. Lily tugged his sleeve. "The big gray one is being a bully," she said, pointing. "Can you do something?" "I can't regulate pigeon social dynamics," he said. "You're not even trying," she said, with the exact disappointed tone of someone who expected more from him and was not afraid to say so. He laughed, out loud, at his daughter's pigeon governance expectations. And the sound surprised him a little, not because laughing was unfamiliar, just because it felt easy, uncomplicated, like something that hadn't needed to be managed at all. He pulled out his phone and typed a text to Isabella. "I'll take the job. Not because of the ledger, not to make things even, because it's the right work and the right time, and Lily says I don't ask for help enough." He put the phone away without waiting for a response. Lily had escalated her pigeon intervention to direct shooing of the aggressive gray one, narrating the situation with the prosecutorial focus she usually reserved for bedtime delay tactics. The response came 4 minutes later. He felt the buzz in his pocket and didn't check it right away. Let it sit there for a moment, the way you let something good sit before you opened it. When he did look, it said, "Lily is going to run something someday, possibly the world." Then after a moment, "Thank you. Start date whenever works for you." He typed, 2 weeks. I need to give proper notice." Her response came immediately. "Of course. See you in 2 weeks, Ryan." He pocketed the phone. On the boardwalk, the aggressive pigeon had retreated and Lily was now distributing bread again with restored equilibrium. The crisis resolved, order returned. She looked up at him with the uncomplicated satisfaction of a child who had fixed a thing that needed fixing. "All better," she announced. "Yeah," he said, looking at his daughter in the cold morning light. "Getting there." The Grant Foundation's offices were on the 14th floor of a building in the financial district that had been designed by someone who believed natural light was a moral position. Glass everywhere. The kind of open floor plan that looked good in architectural photographs and made actual work feel slightly performative, like being productive in a fishbowl. Ryan noticed all of this on his first morning and said nothing about it. His workspace was a shared desk near the community partnerships team. 4 people who had been doing similar outreach work for the foundation and who received him with the particular professional warmth of colleagues who hadn't been consulted about a new hire. Not hostile, just watching. He understood it and didn't take it personally, which was a skill he'd developed in every new environment he'd ever entered. His direct supervisor was a woman named Diana Cho, 40-something, compact and quick-moving, who had been running the foundation's community programs for 3 years and had opinions about everything, most of which she shared without being asked. She shook his hand on day 1 with a grip that communicated she'd wait and see, and that this was the only fair approach. "The health center project is the flagship right now," she told him, walking him through the open floor at a pace that assumed he could keep up. "Permits cleared last week, finally. Construction resumes Monday. We're about 8 months from a soft opening if nothing else goes sideways." Does something usually go sideways? Always. The question is how much sideways. She stopped at a window and pointed north, where Ryan could see the waterfront. "We're partnering with 4 local hospitals for the clinical staffing model. 2 have been straightforward. St. Catherine's has been dragging their feet for 6 weeks on the MOU, and Mercy General—" She stopped. "That's where I was working," he said. "I know. Isabella mentioned it." Diana looked at him with a neutral expression that contained more information than a neutral expression should. She thought it might be useful, given you have relationships there. He processed this. The thought that Isabella had placed him at the intersection of his old hospital and the new work, whether strategically or because she genuinely believed in the logic of it, sat somewhere between thoughtful and presumptuous, and he couldn't decide which side it landed on. "I'll reach out to Gerald Marsh," he said. "He's not the decision maker, but he knows who is." Diana nodded once, the way people nodded when they revised their estimate of someone upward and weren't ready to show it yet. "Good. Weekly check-ins with me, Tuesdays at 9. The team meeting is Thursday mornings. Don't be late to either." "I won't." "Isabella will want a progress update at the end of your first month. She does that with all new foundation staff. Don't let it feel like a test." She paused. "It is a test. but try not to let it feel like one. He saw Isabella for the first time in the office on his fourth day. He'd been in the building every day, but she hadn't been. She split her time between the foundation and the main Grant Technologies headquarters 2 blocks away. And her presence in the foundation office had the quality of weather. You knew it was possible, but you didn't know exactly when it would arrive. He heard her before he saw her, not because she was loud, she wasn't, but because the room's ambient noise shifted slightly when she walked in, the way a space changed when someone entered who people instinctively tracked. He was at his desk working through the Mercy General contact list when he noticed the change and looked up. She was across the room talking to Diana, still in her coat, the left arm no longer in a sling, but held slightly differently from the right. A residual cautiousness, the body remembering an injury the mind was trying to move past. She looked like the person he'd had coffee with at Farley's, and also entirely different. The way people looked when you encountered them in their natural environment after having only met them in neutral ones. She saw him. A brief moment, eye contact across the open floor. And she nodded once, the same way you nodded at someone in a hallway when you'd already said everything there was to say. He nodded back and returned to his list. 20 minutes later, she was standing at the edge of his desk. "How is it so far?" she asked. 4 days? I don't have a strong opinion yet." "Diana?" "Direct, knowledgeable. Waiting to see if I'm worth the trouble." "That sounds right." She glanced at the papers on his desk. He still worked partly on paper, a habit from paramedic days when screens weren't always available. "Mercy General?" "Working on it. There's a new department head since I left. I don't know her well, but I know the people around her. 3 other liaisons tried to get that MOU for 8 months. I know, Diana told me. He looked up at her. I'm not going to get it through leverage or charm. I'm going to get it because the work is worth doing, and eventually someone over there will decide that matters more than institutional caution. She considered him with an expression he was starting to map, when she was actually thinking versus when she was performing consideration. This was the former. That's a slow approach, she said. It usually is, but it tends to stick. A pause. How's Lily? She's lobbying for a fish. The campaign is ongoing. Isabella's expression shifted. Not much, just a small warmth at the edges. What kind? She hasn't specified. I think she considers it a negotiation and she's not showing her cards. Smart, Isabella said. And then she moved on, back across the floor to Diana, and the room's ambient tracking returned to normal. The MOU with Mercy General took 3 weeks and 2 awkward conversations with Gerald, 1 coffee with the new department head, whose name was Dr. Anita Reeves, and who turned out to be sharp and principled and had been resisting the MOU not out of caution, but because a previous version of the agreement had contained a clause that undercut the hospital's clinical autonomy, a clause that no one had flagged to her correctly. Ryan read the agreement, found the clause, and had Diana's legal team revise it in 48 hours. Dr. Reeves signed the following Monday. Diana said, "Good work," in the tone of someone who reserved that phrase for things that actually warranted it, and Ryan thought that was probably the highest functional praise available in her vocabulary. What he hadn't expected was that the news would reach Isabella before he'd had a chance to mention it, and that she would come to find him rather than sending a text. She appeared at his desk at 4:15 on a Tuesday, which was unusual because she typically worked from the GT headquarters on Tuesdays. Reeves signed, she said. Word travels. Diana called me. She pulled the chair from the adjacent empty desk and sat, which was also unusual. She typically stood when she came to his area. How did you get it done? He told her about the clause. Her face did something specific when he described it. A controlled irritation, directed inward. That clause was in there for 4 drafts and no one caught it. Someone probably caught it and didn't know how to flag it without implicating whoever put it in. I put it in, she said flatly, indirectly. That language came from the GT partnership template. I should have had it reviewed for context. She exhaled slowly. I move too fast sometimes. Most people who build things do. That's not an excuse. No, it's just a fact. He leaned back in his chair. The good news is it's fixed and Reeves signed and the partnership is cleaner for having dealt with it. That's the whole outcome. She looked at him steadily. You're very settled. Am I? Most people in new jobs are still performing competence at 3 weeks. You're just doing the thing. Performing competence is exhausting. I don't have the energy for it. It's also what most people think I want. He thought about what to say to that. What do you actually want? She seemed caught slightly off guard by the directness. For people to tell me when I've made a mistake before it costs someone else something. That requires them to believe you won't punish them for it. I don't... She stopped. Is that the perception? I think the perception is that you're fair, but that being fair doesn't always feel safe. There's a difference. She was quiet for a long moment. The office around them had started its late afternoon wind down, people packing up, conversations dropping to a quieter register. My CFO told me something similar about 6 months ago, she said. I thanked him and then completely failed to do anything about it. Why? Because changing the way a room feels when you walk into it requires changing something fundamental about how you operate. And I've been operating this way since I was 23, and it's produced results, and changing it means trusting that the results will still come, even if the approach is different. She paused. That's a hard thing to trust when the stakes are high. The stakes are always high for you. Yes. Then the question isn't whether it's safe to change, it's whether it's worth it. She looked at him. You ask very direct questions. You said you wanted honest answers. This is what that looks like upstream. The corner of her mouth shifted, not quite a smile. Something more complicated. Do you do this with everyone? No, he said honestly. Most people don't ask for it. What? The thing that no one had told him, that he hadn't fully prepared for, was how much the work would pull at something he'd packed away carefully. The health center outreach brought him into contact with the community organizations that would eventually use the facility. Neighborhood health advocates, social workers, the kind of people who did the connective tissue work of public health that never made the news and kept entire communities from falling apart at the seams. He spent time at 2 temporary health clinics on the east side, talking to the staff, understanding the gaps in services that the new center was supposed to fill. On a Wednesday morning in his 5th week, he stood in a cramped room at the back of a community center on Alderton Street and watched a paramedic named Cal walk a frightened older woman through a blood pressure reading, talking to her in a low patient voice, and Ryan felt something move through him that he hadn't felt in 2 years. Not nostalgia, exactly. Something sharper than that. He drove back to the foundation office and sat in his car in the parking structure for 7 minutes before going in, which was the kind of thing he only did when something needed to settle. He didn't mention it to anyone that day. He mentioned it to Isabella 4 days later because by then it had become a thing he was carrying around, and she'd developed the irritating and not entirely unwelcome habit of asking him questions he hadn't given himself permission to think about. They were in the small conference room off the main floor, a quarterly review meeting with Diana and 2 program officers that had run long and everyone else had filtered out. Isabella had stayed to look at the timeline projections Diana had left on the whiteboard, and Ryan had stayed because he'd been the one to pull the projections together, and he wanted to make sure she understood what she was looking at. After a few minutes of her working through the numbers in silence, she said, without turning around, "Something's been different with you this week. I didn't know you tracked that. I track most things. Occupational formation." She turned. What happened? He told her about the Wednesday visit, the paramedic, the older woman. The particular feeling of watching work he'd been trained to do and had stepped away from. She listened to all of it without interrupting, which was something she was getting better at. "Do you want to go back?" she asked. "I don't know. Lily's schedule is solvable." "You sound very certain of that." "Logistics are solvable. That's different from the question I'm asking." She leaned back against the edge of the conference table and looked at him squarely. "Do you want to go back?" He sat with the question. It deserved to be sat with. "I want to not have had to leave," he said finally. That's the honest answer. But I can't have that. So the question is whether going back now in some form is something I want badly enough to figure out the logistics. And I'm still figuring it out. Fair enough? She looked at the whiteboard. Diana mentioned that St. Catherine's is still moving slowly on their partnership agreement. Different problem than Mercy General. It's less about the document and more about the administrator in charge of the decision being conflict-averse and afraid of the board. He recognized the pivot, not avoidance, just her way of keeping movement when a conversation had found its limit. He'd come to understand her gear changes. "I know someone on the St. Catherine's board," he said, "former EMS supervisor. He retired 2 years ago, but he still has relationships." "Could you reach him?" "Probably." "Would you be willing to?" "That's what the job is," he said. "Yes." The contact at St. Catherine's board was a man named Howard Briggs, 63, who had run Metro EMS for 11 years before a back injury had moved him toward administrative work and eventually retirement. Ryan had worked under him for 4 of those years. The relationship was the kind built on accumulated trust in difficult situations. Not personal warmth exactly, but the deep professional respect that came from watching someone make hard calls correctly over a long time. He called Howard on a Thursday evening from his kitchen, Lily in the bath down the hall, the familiar domestic soundscape of running water and intermittent song. "Ryan Carter," Howard said, with the particular tone of someone who was not surprised and not displeased. "I wondered when you'd surface. I'm working with the Grant Foundation now." "I heard. St. Catherine's situation?" Howard didn't wait for confirmation. "Caldwell's the problem. Associate administrator, 34 years old, has never once made a decision without first determining who to blame if it goes wrong. The board wants to approve the partnership, but they're waiting for him to stop obstructing the internal recommendation." "Can you move it?" "I can have a conversation with Joanne Marsh, she's board chair. We have coffee every other week. I'll see if I can get Caldwell out of the process." A pause. "This center, it's real? Not a photo op?" "It's real. I've seen the plans. I've talked to the community organizations that are going in as partners. It's the kind of thing that should have existed 10 years ago." Howard was quiet for a moment. "And this Grant woman, she's committed? Not just for the press?" Ryan thought about Isabella sitting in a diner at 10 in the morning, asking herself out loud whether she actually believed in what she was building. "She's committed," he said. "Okay. I'll talk to Joanne." The street. Catherine's signature came through 2 weeks later. 1. The board meeting that nearly broke everything happened on a Thursday in November, and Ryan was not supposed to be there. He'd been aware, in a peripheral way, that Isabella's board had been applying pressure on the foundation's capital commitments, that the quarterly numbers were slightly below projection, and that there were board members who viewed the health center project as a liability rather than an asset. Diana had mentioned it in passing, the way she mentioned things that were technically above Ryan's level, but that she clearly thought he should know anyway. What he hadn't known was that the board had scheduled an emergency session to formally motion for a pause on the health center project pending financial review, and that the motion had a majority. He found out from Marcus, who called him at 7:15 in the morning on a Thursday. "She's going into the meeting at 9, Marcus said, with the measured tone he used when things were serious. "She asked me to let you know. She said," a pause as though he was reading something. "She said she didn't want you to hear about it after the fact. She said you'd want to know going in." He was at his desk when the meeting started. He had no role in it, no authority in it, and no reason to be anywhere near the conference floor where Grant Technologies' board was assembled. He stayed at his desk and worked on a community clinic intake model he'd been drafting, and he waited. The meeting ran 91 minutes. He knew because he watched the clock with the specific, involuntary attention of someone waiting for medical results. When she came out, he saw her crossing the open floor toward the elevator, coat on, moving fast. Her expression was set in a way he'd come to read as the opposite of composed. Not visibly upset, just locked down in the way people lock down when something had happened that required them to hold their face together while the rest of them figured out what came next. He got up. "Isabella." She stopped, turned. The set of her jaw was doing a lot of work. "They approved the pause," she said. 60-day review period. No capital disbursements for the foundation project." He felt it land, not just as information, but as what it meant to the clinic timeline, to the community groups, to the people who'd been waiting 2 years already. "What happens in 60 days? "They vote again. If the Q4 projections improve, I might have the votes. If they don't..." She stopped. "Can you fund it independently?" Outside the foundation channel? Not without triggering shareholder concerns about capital allocation. Her voice was careful and controlled and had the quality of someone describing a situation they'd already analyzed from every angle and not found a way out of. I have options. I'm working on them. Is there anything I can do? She looked at him. The question seemed to catch her slightly, not the offer, but the plainness of it. I don't know yet, she said. Let me think. Okay, he paused. I'm sorry. The work you're trying to do is good work. That matters, regardless of the vote. She looked at him for a moment longer than she usually did. Then something shifted in the locked-down expression. Not breaking exactly, more like a single thread giving way in something tightly wound. I was in there for an hour and a half, she said, and I gave them every argument I had. Numbers, community impact projections, the partnership agreements you helped build, the whole case. She stopped. And the thing that kept going through my head the whole time was that you were at your desk working on intake models while a room full of people were deciding whether the work was worth doing. He didn't know what to say to that. That seemed important somehow, she said. I don't know why. Because it's what the work looks like when no one's voting on it, he said. Intake models, contact lists, awkward conversations with department heads about problematic clauses. He met her eyes. It's worth doing regardless of what they decided in there. The vote doesn't change that. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she exhaled, slowly, deliberately, the way she exhaled when she was releasing something she'd been holding. I'll figure out the 60 days, she said. I know you will. She nodded once and turned toward the elevator. He went back to his desk and looked at the intake model on his screen, at the small, structured grid of information that represented how a person who needed help would walk through a door and get it. And he thought about what she'd said. You were at your desk working. And what it meant that this had mattered to her in that room. He wasn't sure he fully understood it yet, but he thought he was starting to. It was Marcus who told him about the secondary threat, and Marcus only told him because he had concluded, on his own, without being asked, that Ryan needed to know. They were in the parking structure, both arriving at roughly the same time on a Monday morning, and Marcus had the particular expression of a man who had made a decision overnight and was carrying it with some discomfort. There's a developer named Philip Croce, Marcus said, without preamble. He has interests in the commercial property surrounding the health center site. He's been the pressure behind the permit delays, behind two of the board members who pushed for the pause, and behind a negative piece that ran in the financial press last month about the foundation's capital efficiency. Ryan processed this. She knows? She knows about Croce in general. She doesn't know the scope of his current strategy. Marcus paused. He's met with 3 board members in the last 10 days. I know because I have a contact at the hotel where 2 of those meetings occurred. He's not trying to kill the project. That would draw attention. He's trying to delay it long enough for the construction permits to expire and the community partnerships to dissolve, at which point the foundation board will have sufficient grounds to redirect the capital to something more commercially oriented, which leaves the site available for Croce's development. Marcus confirmed. Ryan stood with this for a moment. The parking structure was quiet around them, early enough that the building hadn't filled yet. Why are you telling me? He said. Marcus was quiet for a beat. Because she'll fight this in the way she fights everything, strategically, systematically, from inside the structure, and that may not be fast enough. He paused again. And because you have relationships with the community organizations and the hospital partners that exist outside Grant Technologies' structure, which means they can't be pressure targeted the same way. You want me to shore up the partnerships? I want the work to survive, Marcus said, with a plainness that cut through everything. Whatever that requires. Ryan looked at him. You've worked for her for 7 years. Yes. You care about the work too. Marcus's expression didn't change much. I care about her, he said. And she cares about the work. So, Ryan nodded slowly. He thought about a woman on a construction site in a storm, asking herself whether she believed in what she was building. He thought about 60 days and a developer named Philip Croce and community groups who'd been waiting 2 years and intake models for a clinic that wasn't open yet. He thought about how some problems weren't solvable with resources. And then he thought about which ones were. "Tell me everything you know about Croce," he said. Marcus looked at him with something that might have been relief. "There's a coffee place 2 blocks north," he said. "I'll buy." They walked out of the parking structure into the cold morning, and Ryan turned his jacket collar up against the wind and thought that whatever this had started as, a rainy night, a burning vehicle, a woman who believed everything was solvable, and a man who believed otherwise, it had become something else now, something with more at stake than either of them had bargained for. And he found, to his own quiet surprise, that he was not afraid of that. What Marcus knew about Philip Croce filled an hour and a half of conversation, and left Ryan with the particular unpleasant feeling of understanding a problem completely and not yet knowing what to do about it. Croce was 61, a commercial developer who had been building and acquiring properties in the city's eastern corridor for nearly 2 decades. He wasn't the kind of person who appeared in profiles, He avoided press the way certain animals avoided open ground, instinctively and with purpose. His name showed up in permit filings, in LLC structures that owned properties that other LLCs developed, in the kind of corporate layering that was entirely legal and entirely designed to make causation difficult to trace. He had relationships with 3 members of Isabella's board, relationships that predated the Grant Foundation by years, built through the slow, patient work of shared investment interests and the particular social architecture of men who believed the city belonged to whoever could afford to shape it. The health center site was the last undeveloped commercial parcel on a stretch of the eastern waterfront that Croce had been quietly assembling for 4 years. Everything around it was already his, in one form or another. The site itself had been donated to the foundation by a previous landowner who had specifically wanted it used for community benefit, a restriction that was legally binding but had a sunset clause. If the foundation failed to break ground within a defined operational window and maintain active development, the restriction could be challenged. That window, Marcus explained over bad coffee, in a place with no atmosphere and excellent acoustics for private conversation, closed in 7 months. 60 days of board-mandated review, followed by a potentially hostile revote, followed by the logistical time required to restart paused construction. The math was close. Not impossible. But Croce had clearly done the math too. "He doesn't need to kill it," Ryan said. "He just needs to make it miss the window." "Correct. And if the window closes? The restriction challenge goes to probate court. It could take years, by which point the community partnerships will have dissolved, the construction financing will have expired, and the board will have moved the capital elsewhere." Marcus's voice was even. "He wins, without ever appearing to have done anything." Ryan stared at his coffee. "She needs to know the full scope." "I know. Why haven't you told her?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Because when Isabella knows something, she acts on it. And her instinct in a situation like this is to move on Croce directly, legally, publicly, with everything she has, which is one approach. But Croce has lawyers who have been anticipating exactly that response for months. A direct confrontation plays into his timeline. It delays things further and gives the board additional grounds for the review extension." He looked at Ryan steadily. "I thought there might be a different approach, one that didn't require her to fight on his ground. You want to make the project undeniable before she goes after him. I want the community case to be so concrete and so publicly visible that any board member who votes against it is voting against something people can see and name and care about." Marcus paused. "The partnerships you've built, the hospital agreements, the community organizations. Right now, those exist as documents. They need to exist as people." Ryan sat with that. It was, he thought, a better strategy than anything confrontational. It was also the kind of strategy that required every relationship he'd built in 2 months to show up at the right moment and in the right form, and that was not something he could guarantee. "I'll need 2 weeks," he said. "You have the 60-day clock." "I'm not using 60 days. If this takes 60 days, it's already too late." He drank the bad coffee and thought about Howard Briggs and Dr. Anita Reeves and the social workers on Alderton Street and the paramedic named Cal. 2 weeks. Then she needs to know everything." Marcus nodded. "Agreed." Ryan put his cup down. "You're good at this," he said. "Not a compliment exactly. more like an observation. 7 years, Marcus said simply. You learn the shape of the problems. He didn't tell Isabella what he was doing. This bothered him more than he expected it to. He had built a reflexive honesty with her over the previous weeks. Not confessional, not effortful, just the baseline directness that he'd established from the beginning and that she'd come to rely on in a way that was visible to him even when she probably didn't intend it to be. Withholding something felt like a small fracture in something that had been solid. He told himself it was temporary and purposeful, and that she would understand when he explained it. He mostly believed this, the part of him that didn't keep surfacing at inconvenient times. He started with Howard Briggs, who was already aware of the Croce situation in broad strokes and had opinions that were pointed and useful. Howard connected him to the city's community health advocacy network, a loose coalition of neighborhood organizations, social service agencies, and patient advocacy groups that had been trying to fill the gap the health center was designed to address. Ryan had been in contact with several of these groups already through his outreach work, but he hadn't yet understood how to coordinate them in any unified way. He made that his task for the first week. He worked early mornings and evenings, after Lily was asleep, drafting a community impact presentation that was not a presentation in any corporate sense. No slide decks, no infographics, no polished formatting. It was a document that contained names and stories and specific gaps in healthcare access with specific numbers attached. The kind of thing that was harder to dismiss than an economic projection because it was about people who already existed and could be pointed to. He drove to Alderton Street on a Thursday afternoon and sat with Maria Torres, who ran the neighborhood health advocacy office out of a converted storefront, and asked her to tell him about the cases she couldn't serve. She talked for an hour and 20 minutes. He took notes by hand. He called Dr. Reeves at Mercy General and asked her for the specific data on uninsured patients presenting at the emergency department with conditions that should have been managed at the primary care level. She sent him a spreadsheet that told a story she'd been trying to tell the city council for 2 years. He talked to Cal, the paramedic from Alderton, who turned out to be named Calvin Marsh, no relation to Gerald, and asked him about the calls that came in from the Eastern District that a functional community clinic would have prevented. Cal had a memory for details that was characteristic of people who worked in emergency medicine and had learned to record the world carefully because sometimes the details were the difference. He gave Ryan numbers, and he gave him 2 specific cases that had ended badly in ways they shouldn't have. By the end of the first week, Ryan had a document that was 43 pages long and read like what it was, evidence compiled by someone who had worked in these systems and understood them from the inside. He sent it to Diana on a Sunday evening with a subject line that said, "For the board review. Read before Monday." Her response came 40 minutes later. "Where did all of this come from?" He typed back, "The people it's about." A pause, then, "I'll have it formatted for distribution by morning." He put his phone down and looked at the dark window of his kitchen and thought about how he still needed to tell Isabella about Croce and about the 7 months and about the shape of the trap she was in. He thought about the right moment and the right way to say it, which was a thing he'd always done. Considered the delivery of hard information carefully because how something was said changed what the person hearing it was able to do with it. He picked a Tuesday. He asked if she had 30 minutes. She said she had 20. He took her to the small conference room and closed the door and told her everything. Croce, the board relationships, the 7-month window, the sunset clause on the property restriction. He gave it to her in order clearly, without softening any part of it. She listened with the stillness she used when she was processing something significant. Not frozen. She shifted once, crossed her arms, uncrossed them, but very quiet, with the particular quality of someone running calculations that required all available attention. When he finished, she was silent for a moment. "How long have you known this?" 12 days. Her eyes came to his. "Why didn't you tell me immediately?" "Because Marcus was right that your first instinct would be to move on Croce directly, and that playing that hand too early was what Croce was counting on." He held her gaze. "I spent 12 days building the community case first, so that when you go to the board revote, you're not asking them to override Croce's strategy. You're asking them to vote against 43 pages of documented human need." The silence was a different kind now. She was looking at him in a way he couldn't fully read. Not angry, not relieved, something more complicated than either. You made a strategic decision on my behalf, she said, without telling me. Yes. I don't love that. I know. I'm sorry for the part that was wrong. I'm not sorry for the outcome. She looked away for a moment. Out the glass wall of the conference room, the open floor moved around them in its ordinary rhythms. What's in the 43 pages? She said finally. He told her. She asked specific questions, numbers, sources, the names of the people he'd talked to. He answered each one. As he walked her through it, something in her posture changed. Not dramatically, not in any way that someone who didn't know her would have noticed, but he did notice. The lockdown quality dissolved and was replaced by something that looked, from where he was sitting, like a woman who had been handed a reason to keep going and was feeling the weight of it. Maria Torres, she said when he mentioned the Alderton Street office. I've seen her name in community board minutes. She's been asking for the center for 3 years. She has a waiting list of 47 people for services she can't provide. Isabella pressed 2 fingers briefly to her mouth, a contained gesture. Okay, she said. Okay. She was quiet again for a second. The legal angle on Croce. We need to document the board meeting interference. I have a securities attorney who handles conflict of interest disclosures. If we can establish that board votes were influenced by a party with direct commercial interest in the outcome, Marcus has documentation on the hotel meetings. She looked at him. Marcus knew too? Marcus told me. A beat. Of course he did. She exhaled. He's been protecting me from information he thought I'd mishandle for 7 years. I've been aware of this and mostly grateful for it. She paused. I should probably be more bothered by it. You can be bothered later, Ryan said. Right now you have 18 days left in the 60-day window and 3 board members whose votes you need to move. She nodded, the way she nodded when she was already moving past the current moment into the next series of problems. The presentation to the board needs to include community representation, not just data, people. She looked at him. Can you get Maria Torres in a room with my board? I'll ask her. Would she come? She's been asking for that room for 3 years. She'll come. For the first time since he'd started talking, something shifted in Isabella's expression that was closer to hope than to strategy. It was brief. She moved through it quickly, but he saw it. Ryan. She stopped, started again. The 12 days. I understand why you did it the way you did. But don't do it again. I'd rather fight on the wrong ground with all the information than the right ground without it. She held his gaze. I need to know things, even when they're hard. Understood, he said. That's fair. It's not about fair, she said quietly. It's about trust. The word landed in the room and stayed there. The board presentation was on a Thursday morning, 17 days into the review window. Ryan had spent the preceding week working with Diana and Isabella's communications team on the structure of it. Maria Torres confirmed she'd attend. Dr. Reeves submitted a formal letter of support with the emergency department data attached. Howard Briggs reached out to the board chair through their established channel. Cal Marsh, after some persuading, agreed to speak for 5 minutes about field-level conditions in the Eastern District. Isabella's securities attorney filed a preliminary disclosure notice about the Croce-related board meeting conflicts, which didn't immediately disqualify the conflicted votes, but introduced enough formal process that the 3 board members in question retained their own counsel and became significantly more cautious about their public positions. Ryan did not present. This was intentional. His role was the infrastructure behind the case, not the face of it. He sat in the back row of the boardroom, which was on the 32nd floor, with a view of the city that felt almost ironic given what they were fighting about. And he watched. Maria Torres spoke for 8 minutes. She had the quality of someone who had been talking to policymakers for years without being heard, and had consequently developed a way of speaking that was precise and immovable. She talked about specific people, by first name, who had conditions that had deteriorated because primary care was inaccessible. She talked about what she needed and what the health center would provide, and why 8 months more delay was not an abstraction. It was a woman named Patricia whose diabetes management had lapsed, and a teenager named Jerome whose mental health support had evaporated when the local free clinic lost its funding. The room was quiet in a way boardrooms were rarely quiet. Isabella presented the data second. She didn't soften it or package it in the language of corporate benefit. She gave it the way Ryan had given it to her, plainly, with the weight of specificity. She addressed the financial concerns directly and then said something he hadn't heard her say in any meeting context before. The question in front of this board isn't whether we can afford to continue this project. It's whether we're willing to be the organization that chose not to. Cal spoke third. He was not a natural public speaker. He was better with his hands than with rooms, and it showed. But it also showed in a useful way because the mild discomfort of a working paramedic in a glass boardroom had a particular kind of honesty that no amount of polish could have replicated. He described 2 calls. He described the gaps. He said simply that a clinic in the Eastern District would save lives in ways that he could document from his call logs, and that he would be happy to provide those logs if the board wanted them. The vote was not unanimous. It was never going to be unanimous, but it was enough. 7-4 in favor of resuming capital disbursements and lifting the pause. Diana texted Ryan from 2 rows ahead while the result was still being read. "We got it." He put his phone in his pocket and looked at the city through the glass wall and exhaled slowly. Isabella was across the room, accepting the formal confirmation from the board chair, and she turned once, briefly, and found him in the back row with her eyes. She didn't smile. She just nodded, the same contained acknowledgement from across a room that she'd given him on his first day in the office. He nodded back. The drive home that evening was the longest he'd taken in weeks. He picked Lily up from Mrs. Okafor's at 7, which was later than usual, and she was in her pajamas already and slightly drowsy, draped over his shoulder in the way she did when she was too tired to be fully awake, but too wired to actually sleep. "How was your day?" she murmured into his collar. "Long," he said. "Good." "Did you do something important?" He thought about that. "I helped some people who deserved help." "Good," she said, with the satisfied simplicity of a child for whom this was a complete and sufficient answer. He put her to bed and sat in the kitchen afterward for a long time. He made tea he didn't drink. He looked at the crab magnet on the refrigerator and thought about how much had changed in the shape of his life in 2 months, not in ways that were visible from the outside, not in the salary or the address or the surface inventory, but in something harder to name: the sense of movement. The specific engagement of working on something that mattered in a way he could follow through from his desk to a real place where real people would eventually walk through a real door. His phone lit up at 9:47. "I've been trying to figure out how to say this all evening, and I keep starting and deleting it, so I'm just going to send it before I delete this one too. What you built in those 12 days, the 43 pages, the community voices, the network you pulled together, that wasn't your job. It was above and beyond anything I hired you to do. And it made the difference. I know that. I want you to know that I know that." He read it twice. Then he typed, "It was the right work. That's the whole reason. 3 dots. Then, you keep saying things like that, and I keep not having a response. You don't need one." A longer pause this time. Then, "Ryan, can I ask you something personal?" "Sure. Do you ever get lonely?" He sat with that for a moment. The kitchen was quiet around him. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere down the hall, Lily breathed her steady, sleeping breath. "Yes," he typed. "Do you?" The response took longer than usual, long enough that he thought she might not answer, or might answer with something deflecting, a pivot, a joke, the gear change he'd come to recognize. But then, all the time. "I've been surrounded by people for 6 years, and I've been alone in most of the rooms I was in. I didn't know that was a description of loneliness until recently." He read it again. "What changed recently?" he typed. Another pause. Then, "I started having conversations where I had to actually think about what I meant instead of what I wanted to communicate. Those are different things. Most of my conversations are the second kind." He understood this completely, which was itself something. "Yes," he wrote, "they are." He looked at his phone in his hand. Thought about a woman sitting somewhere in a city he could see from a 32nd floor, alone in whatever room she was in, saying something true because she had decided to stop deleting it. He put the phone on the counter and went to check on Lily one more time the way he always did before he slept. The covers pulled back down to her waist as predicted, the arm over the edge, the slightly open mouth. He fixed the blanket, stood in the doorway for a moment. He went back to the kitchen and picked up the phone. "You should get some sleep," he typed. "Tomorrow the construction resumes." "I know, I'm going to stand on that site in the morning." "In actual boots this time?" A beat. Then, "I have been informed by Marcus that proper site footwear is non-negotiable. Marcus is right about most things." "He is. It's occasionally insufferable." A pause. "Good night, Ryan." "Good night, Isabella." He put the phone down and stood in his kitchen in the quiet of a house where everything was the same as it had been that morning, and also somehow not, the way things shifted gradually and without announcement until you looked at them from a different angle and realized the shape had changed. He thought about 47 people on a waiting list and a woman named Patricia and a teenager named Jerome. He thought about what it meant to build something that would outlast the crisis it had survived. He thought about loneliness and the specific disorienting experience of finding someone who seemed to understand the shape of it without having been told the dimensions. He turned off the kitchen light. Through the window, the city held its dark and lit geometry, patient and indifferent. And somewhere in it, a billionaire in a room was deciding to stop deleting the honest things. And a single father in a kitchen was learning, for the first time in a long time, that not every kind of change was something to be managed carefully before it became something larger. Some of it you just had to let arrive. The construction resumed on a Monday. Isabella was there at 7 in the morning in steel-toed boots that still had the store sticker on the sole, which Ryan noticed and didn't mention. She stood at the edge of the site in the cold November air and watched the first crew move into position, and he stood a few feet away doing the same. And neither of them said anything for a while because there wasn't anything that needed to be said. The machines moved. The ground was broken again. That was enough. Marcus stood by the car at the street, giving them the particular courtesy of pretending to look at his phone. "It's smaller than I expected," Isabella said finally. Not disappointed, just recalibrating. From the architectural renderings, it seemed larger. "It'll feel different when the walls go up." "I know. I've built things before." She paused. "I've never stood and watched one start, though. I usually just see the finished product." He looked at her profile. The careful set of it, the slight tension she held in her jaw that he'd come to understand as concentration rather than anxiety. She was taking the moment in deliberately, he realized, making herself actually feel it rather than processing it as information and moving to the next thing. That was new, or newer than it had been. "You should take a picture," he said. She glanced at him. "Why?" "Because in 8 months you'll want to remember what it looked like at the beginning. The finished product is its own thing, but the start is when you know what it cost." She looked at him for a moment, then pulled out her phone and took one photograph. Not staged, not aimed at anything iconic, just the site as it was, a rectangle of turned earth and machinery and morning light. She put the phone away. "How's Lily?" "She's decided that if she can't have a fish, she wants a dog." Isabella's expression shifted into the warm edge he'd come to watch for. "That's an escalation." She framed it as a compromise. "She negotiated you up to a larger ask." "I'm aware. I've been outmaneuvered by a 6-year-old. Isabella looked back at the site. "She's going to be something," she said. "Whatever she decides to do." "I know." He said it simply, without the deflecting humor he sometimes used when the conversation moved toward Lily in ways that felt too exposed. He just meant it plainly, and let it be that. They stood there a while longer. The crew worked. The morning held its cold clarity. The Croce situation resolved itself in the way that certain problems resolved, not dramatically, but through the slow application of process and the particular deterrent effect of documentation. Isabella's securities attorney filed the formal conflict of interest disclosure with the board, which triggered a governance review. 2 of the 3 conflicted board members voluntarily recused themselves from any further votes related to the foundation project. The 3rd retained counsel and said nothing publicly, which was its own kind of answer. Croce himself never made direct contact. He was not the kind of person who made direct contact. But the pressure on the surrounding development projects eased in a way that Marcus tracked and reported, and which amounted, in practical terms, to a withdrawal. When the path to delay closed, the interest in creating delay dissolved with it. It wasn't justice, exactly. Ryan thought about that. The fact that a man who had spent months engineering obstacles to a community health center would face no real consequence beyond the failure of his strategy. The two board members who'd been influenced would continue serving. The machinery that had nearly killed the project would remain intact, available for future use against future things. He said this to Isabella one evening in late November, sitting in her office after everyone else had left, a habit they'd developed without either of them naming it, these end-of-day conversations that ran long and covered ground that wasn't in any job description. "It bothers me," he said, "that he just walks away." "I know." She was turned slightly in her chair, one leg tucked under her in the posture she allowed herself only when the office was empty, which he'd noticed, and which he understood as a form of trust. "It bothers me too, but the alternative is a legal fight that takes 2 years and costs us something we'd rather spend on the clinic." That's the rational answer. It's also the true one. She paused. "I spent a lot of my 20s fighting battles because they deserved to be fought, regardless of the cost. I won most of them, and I lost things I didn't fully value until they were gone." She looked at him. "I'm trying to be smarter about what I spend myself on now." That sounds like wisdom. It sounds like exhaustion dressed up as wisdom. I'm not always sure there's a difference. He thought about that. "I think there is a difference. Wisdom knows what it's protecting. Exhaustion is just done." She considered this with the genuine attention she gave to things that mattered to her. "Which one do you operate from?" "Depends on the week," he said honestly. "Some weeks both. Sometimes mid-sentence." She smiled, not the brief controlled kind, but a full one, unguarded, the kind she seemed to have more of lately. "That's the most honest description of adulthood I've heard." "I've had some practice." The office was quiet around them. Outside the windows, the city had done its evening transformation into light, the particular beauty of a place you knew well enough to stop seeing and then caught again at the right hour in the right light. "Ryan," she said, in a tone that was different from her usual register, slightly careful, like she was measuring the approach. "Yeah. I need to tell you something, and I want to do it without it becoming a discussion about what it means before I've actually said it." He waited. "I've been thinking about what you said, about not spending yourself on the wrong battles, and about what you asked, whether I'm happy." She stopped, started again with the precision of someone who had rehearsed this and then discarded the rehearsal. "I'm happier than I've been in years, and I think a significant part of that is you, the conversations, the work, the way you talk to me like I'm a person who is capable of being wrong and worth talking to anyway." She held his gaze. "I don't know exactly what to do with that yet. I'm not good at this part. I know how to build companies. I don't know how to say the thing I'm trying to say without making it sound like a transaction or a strategy." He was quiet for a moment, not because he didn't have a response, but because he wanted to give the space the moment deserved. "You just said it," he told her. "That wasn't a transaction." It felt clumsy. "Clumsy things are usually true things," he said. "The polished version is almost never the real one." She exhaled slowly. "Are you going to tell me what you think, or are you going to be careful about it?" "I'm going to be honest about it," he said, which is different from being careful. He turned his chair slightly to face her more directly. "I've been in this room with you at the end of enough days to know that this isn't proximity. This isn't gratitude or convenience or two people thrown together by a situation." He paused. "I think about you when I'm not here. I think about what you'd say about things. I listen differently to things because I know I'll be telling you about them." He stopped. Let it sit. "That's what I think." The silence between them was warm rather than tense, the kind of silence that contained something rather than avoided it. "I don't want to complicate your life," she said quietly. "Lily, the work, the balance you've built. You're not a complication," he said. "You're the opposite of a complication. You're the first person in a long time who made things feel more possible instead of less." She looked at him steadily. Then she reached across the space between the chairs and put her hand on his, just briefly, a contact that lasted maybe 3 seconds and wasn't romantic in the way films made things romantic. There was no music, No convenient lighting shift, no graceful lean. It was just a hand on a hand in a quiet office after a long day between two people who had spent months learning what the other was made of. It was enough. More than enough. December arrived with the cold that the city wore well, the kind of winter that made the streets look cleaner and the lights look warmer and gave people permission to want things they spent the rest of the year pretending they didn't need. The health center's frame went up in the third week. Ryan drove past it on a Tuesday evening with Lily in the back seat, on their way home from her school holiday performance, and he stopped the car at the curb and pointed. "That's going to be a clinic," he said, "where people can go when they're sick and get help." Lily looked at it with the serious attention she brought to things she was evaluating. "Did you help build it?" "I helped make sure it could be built." She was quiet for a moment. "That's also important," she said finally, with the particular judicial generosity of someone who had considered whether to grant credit and decided it was deserved. "Thank you," he said. "You're welcome." She looked out the window a moment longer. "Dad? Is Isabella your friend?" He glanced in the rearview mirror. Her expression was the careful, watchful one she wore when she was asking something she'd been sitting with for a while. "Yes," he said. "She is." "A regular friend or a different kind?" He exhaled slowly. "A different kind. Is that okay?" She appeared to think about it with genuine seriousness, which he found both touching and slightly nerve-wracking. "Does she make you less tired?" "Yeah, she does." "Okay," Lily said, with the calm of a person for whom this was the relevant metric. "Then it's okay." He drove the rest of the way home with the heater running and the coin rattle noise from the engine that he'd been listening to for 3 years, and he thought about how his daughter had just issued a verdict on the shape of his life with more wisdom than most adults he knew, and he thought that whatever he'd done right in 6 years of imperfect, exhausted, trying his best fatherhood, some of it had clearly taken. He told Claire about Isabella on a Sunday call in mid-December, while Lily was at a birthday party and he had the house to himself for 2 hours, which he used for laundry and the kind of conversation that needed quiet. "I knew," Claire said immediately. "You didn't know." "I suspected heavily, and I knew enough. Every time you mentioned her, your voice did the thing." "What thing?" "The thing where you talk about something you're trying not to care about too much in case it doesn't work out." She paused. "You did it with EMS work for years before you admitted you missed it." Same voice. He sat on the couch with a basket of unfolded laundry at his feet. "That's a very specific analysis. I've been your sister for 34 years. I know your voices." "She's..." He stopped. Started again. "She's not easy. She's demanding and occasionally infuriating, and she moves at a speed that requires effort to keep up with. But she's honest when she doesn't have to be. And she's trying to be different than she was in ways that cost her something, and she does it without asking anyone to applaud her for it." He paused. "And she makes me feel like the version of me that I thought I'd had to put away is actually still there." Claire was quiet for a moment. "That's not a small thing." "No." "What about Lily?" "Lily gave her approval last Tuesday in the car using a metric of her own design." "Which was?" "Whether Isabella makes me less tired." Claire laughed, genuinely, fully. "I love that kid. She'd approve of that." "Ryan," her voice shifted. "You deserve this. I need you to hear that and not deflect it." He sat with it, folded a shirt slowly. "I'm working on it." "Work faster," she said. "You've been in survival mode for 2 years. Let yourself have something." He told Isabella about Claire's call 2 days later, not all of it, just the shape of it, that his sister had weighed in unsolicited and that the verdict was favorable. Isabella was quiet for a moment. "You told your sister about me." "She extracted the information. There's a difference." "Did she?" "She identified a voice pattern. Apparently I have one for things I care about, but am trying not to show." Isabella looked at him across the conference table, where they were supposed to be reviewing the soft opening timeline, which had been technically underway for 20 minutes and had not made much technical progress. "What does the voice sound like?" she asked. "Controlled," he said. "Careful." She was quiet again. Then, almost to herself, I think I have the same one. He looked at her. I know. She looked back. Is that obvious? To me, he said. Probably not to most people. Something in her expression shifted. The particular vulnerability of being seen clearly by someone and finding that you didn't want to look away from it. I'm not very experienced at this, she said. In the real sense. I've had relationships that were convenient and relationships that made sense on paper, and one that I ended because I realized 3 years in that I'd been performing closeness rather than actually having it. She paused. I don't want to do that again. You're not doing that. How do you know? Because performing closeness doesn't involve telling someone at 9:40 at night that you're lonely. It doesn't involve admitting out loud that you don't know if you believe in what you're building. He looked at her steadily. You've been real with me since the diner. It's been inconvenient for you, and you've done it anyway. She absorbed this. You make it sound deliberate, isn't it? A beat. Yes, she said quietly. I suppose it is. He reached across the table, not dramatic, not orchestrated, just a straightforward movement, and took her hand. She looked down at it, and then up at him, and she didn't move away, and that was all the answer either of them needed. The soft opening timeline, she said, after a moment, is in good shape, he said. 8 months is achievable. You haven't looked at it. I've been looking at it all week. He turned the folder around and slid it toward her. Page 4. The bottleneck is the HVAC subcontractor. Diana's on it. She looked at the folder, then at him. You're very annoying sometimes. I know. It's one of the things She stopped, smiled, turned to page 4. January brought the new year, and with it the first real test of what they were building personally, which came not in any dramatic form, but in the ordinary form that real tests usually arrived. A Tuesday evening, Lily sick with a fever, Ryan fielding calls from the foundation while monitoring his daughter's temperature from the couch. The balance he'd managed for 2 years suddenly squeezed from every direction at once. He called Isabella to push their standing Wednesday morning meeting. Of course, she said immediately. How is she? It's a fever, probably 24-hour. She's talking, which means she's fine. She went quiet for a while, and that's when I worried. What does she do when she's sick? Watches the same animated movie 3 times in a row and narrates it at me as though I haven't seen it. Which one? He looked at the television. The one with the elephant who wants to be a conductor. I don't know that one. You're not missing anything. I've seen it 11 times. He paused. She keeps asking for you, by the way. Silence on the other end. A brief, specific silence. Lily asks about me, Isabella said. She asks whether you've eaten. She has opinions about whether you take care of yourself. She asked me last week if you had a good coat. Another silence. Isabella stopped. That's very kind of her. She's decided you need looking after. I don't have any influence over this determination. It's been made. He heard something on the other end that was not quite a word, a small sound, caught and managed, the kind that people made when something hit them unexpectedly and they were trying to absorb it quietly. Tell her I have a very good coat, Isabella said finally, and that I'll bring her something when she's better. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. He understood the distinction. Okay. She brought a book 3 days later when Lily was recovered and back to full operational loudness. It was a picture book about a girl who builds bridges. Not a famous one, not something from a best of list, but something Isabella had found in a small independent bookshop and clearly chosen with thought. It had annotations in the margins from a previous reader, which Lily found fascinating and spent 20 minutes reading aloud. Ryan stood in the kitchen doorway watching Isabella sit on the living room floor with his daughter, both of them leaning over the book, Lily explaining what each annotation might mean, Isabella listening with the complete attention she usually reserved for quarterly reviews. It was a completely ordinary scene, and it was the most undone he'd felt in years. He turned back to the kitchen and stood over the stove and thought about how the things that changed you most profoundly rarely announced themselves. They just arrived in the form of a woman sitting on your floor reading margin notes with your daughter, and you stood in a doorway and felt the architecture of your life quietly rearranging. The clinic's soft opening was on a Saturday in late August. Ryan had been there all week for final preparations. The intake systems, the community outreach, the coordination with hospital partners, the small logistical details that accumulated toward the end of any large project and required someone willing to stay late and track each one to its resolution. He'd gone home every evening to Lily and come back every morning and felt, in the marrow of it, the particular satisfaction of work that was pointed at something real. Isabella had been there too, in her way, not in the building, but present in every decision, available for every problem, moving the obstructions that required her level of reach to move. She had, over the months of construction, changed in ways that he thought even she hadn't fully tracked. She delegated more and controlled less. She asked questions in board meetings rather than presenting positions. She had started reading field reports from the community health teams before the executive summaries, which Diana had mentioned to Ryan with the expression of someone who considered this a minor miracle. She was not a different person. She was the same person making different choices, which was harder and more interesting than transformation. On the morning of the opening, they arrived early. Before the staff, before the community partners, before the ribbon and the city council member who would later stand in front of microphones and describe the project in language that credited everyone who'd been involved and also somehow made it sound mostly like a political achievement. Before all of that, the building was just itself, clean and empty and waiting, smelling of fresh paint and new carpet, the morning light coming through the east-facing windows in wide, pale bands. Ryan walked the main corridor from the entrance to the intake area and stood at the reception desk and tried to imagine it full. Isabella came and stood next to him. "Patricia," she said. He looked at her. "Maria Torres called me last week." "Patricia?" "From the waiting list. She's signed up as one of the first patients. Her diabetes management has been stable since she started with a temporary clinic 2 months ago when we got emergency funding to extend their services." She paused. "She'll be here today." He didn't say anything. "Jerome is doing better too," she added. "He started with a counselor. He's 17. He's talking about community college." He put a hand on the reception desk and pressed into it slightly, the way you steadied yourself when something hit the center of your chest and you needed to keep standing. "You checked on them," he said. "I asked Maria. I wanted to know." She looked at the empty intake area, the chairs, the door that would open in 2 hours. "I wanted to know if we got to them in time." He turned to look at her. She was looking ahead, steady, composed, but holding something. "You did," he said. She nodded once. Then she exhaled, long and slow, and turned to him, and she didn't look like a billionaire CEO in that moment. She looked like a person who had built something that mattered and was standing in the space of what it had cost and what it was worth and finding that the second number was bigger. "You know what I keep thinking about?" she said. "What?" "That night on the construction site. The rain. You telling me not to move my neck." She almost smiled. "I thought you were a passerby." "I was." "No," she said. "You were exactly who you were supposed to be. I just didn't know it yet." He looked at her. "I'm not sure I believe in things being supposed to be." "I know you don't." She met his eyes. "But I'm starting to wonder." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. A small gesture, unpracticed, slightly awkward in the way real tenderness always was. She didn't move away. She leaned into it slightly, which was its own language. "We should get the chairs ready," he said. "In a minute." "In a minute," he agreed. They stood there together in the quiet of a building that was about to become something. Not perfect, not finished, already carrying the seeds of a dozen problems they hadn't encountered yet. The HVAC was going to need attention by October. The parking situation was worse than projected. Dr. Reeves had flagged a gap in the mental health referral pathway that would require at least 2 additional counselors to address properly. Maria Torres had a list of families who needed services that the clinic wasn't yet equipped to provide. All of that was real. All of it was coming. But for a minute they stood in the morning light and let the building be what it was, evidence that 2 people from opposite ends of the world had stumbled into each other at the worst possible moment and had, slowly and imperfectly, and through a great deal of stubbornness on both sides, made something that would outlast the collision. Quote, The thing about lives is that they don't resolve cleanly. They don't reach a moment where everything settles into place and the questions stop and the work becomes easy. Anyone who has lived long enough and been honest about it knows this. The people who tell you otherwise are either selling something or protecting themselves from the knowledge that the struggle doesn't end, it just changes shape. Ryan Carter knew this. He'd known it for a long time. He'd built his whole way of moving through the world around the understanding that stability wasn't the absence of difficulty, it was the capacity to meet difficulty without falling apart. What he hadn't known until recently was that this capacity could be shared, that you could find someone else who met hard things squarely and let them stand beside you and find that the weight distributed differently, that the same load felt lighter, not because it was smaller, but because it had two sets of hands. He hadn't known that because he hadn't let himself look for it. He'd been too focused on not needing it. That was the thing he'd gotten wrong. The single significant error in the long, careful management of his life. Not the job change, not the nights away or the tire or the towel in the window. Those were all correct decisions made in difficult circumstances. The error was smaller and harder to see. He had confused not needing rescue with not needing anyone. Lily had seen it before he did, from the back seat of a 10-year-old Honda Civic, with the unsentimental clarity of a child who loved her father clearly enough to tell him the truth. You don't ask for help enough. She was right. She was 6, and she was right. By November of that year, Ryan was splitting his time between the foundation and a part-time return to emergency medical work. Not ambulance shifts, not yet, but a partnership with Metro EMS's community training program that put him in contact with new paramedics and emergency responders in exactly the kind of practical education role that didn't require him to be away from Lily for 24 hours at a time. It was Howard Briggs who had brought him the opportunity, quietly, in the way that Howard did things, presenting a fully formed option to someone he'd decided deserved it and letting them choose. He chose. The first training session he led, he stood in front of 14 new paramedic candidates in a converted classroom at the EMS training facility and felt something click back into place that had been slightly dislocated for 2 years. Not dramatic, not a revelation, just the specific alignment of a person doing what they were built for. He was not the same paramedic he'd been at 28. He was slower and more patient and had lost some of the electric certainty of youth, and in its place had something that he thought was more useful. The knowledge that certainty was overrated and that the most important skill in emergency medicine, as in most things, was the ability to stay present in uncertainty without letting it paralyze you. He tried to teach that. He wasn't always sure the candidates understood it yet. They would. Isabella bought the second apartment. Not for herself. She gave it to the foundation as transitional housing for healthcare workers doing residency rotations at the community health center. It was the apartment she'd bought during the period when she was making decisions with her net worth instead of her judgment, and this felt, to her, like the correct use for it. She mentioned it to Ryan at dinner on a Thursday evening. They had Thursday evenings now, a quiet domestic regularity that had accumulated without either of them formally proposing it. He looked at her across the table and said, "That's the right thing to do with it." "I know," she said. "I figured it out about 8 months ago. I was just waiting until I was sure I wasn't doing it for the optics." "And now you're sure?" "Now I'm sure." He nodded. He didn't say "I'm proud of you" because that had the wrong shape. Too parental, too much distance in it. What he felt was simpler than pride. It was the particular satisfaction of watching someone you cared about do something that cost them something because they'd decided it was right. He felt it, and he didn't say it, and she looked at him, and he thought she knew it anyway, which was one of the things that had changed between them. The growing grammar of what didn't have to be said. Lily was telling them about a school project on ecosystems, specifically the role of decomposers, which she had decided was the most important job because without them, everything would just stay broken forever. She said this with the conviction of someone who had given it genuine thought. Ryan looked at his daughter and thought, yes. He looked at Isabella, who was listening to Lily with the complete specific attention she gave to things she was genuinely interested in, one elbow on the table, chin in hand, asking a question about earthworms that made Lily erupt into the enthusiastic lecture of a child who has been invited to talk about what she knows. He thought about a stormy night on a road he wasn't supposed to be on, about kneeling in the mud, about a woman who believed everything could be solved with resources and a man who believed otherwise, and how they'd both been partially right, and how the truth was somewhere in the negotiation between the two. He thought about 47 names on a waiting list. He thought about Patricia and Jerome and the 14 paramedic candidates and the building on the east side that was open 5 days a week and had a waiting room that was full most mornings. He thought about his daughter, who understood decomposers and dragons and overdue library fines, and the governance of pigeons who had grown up watching her father carry everything alone and had decided, at age 6, to tell him to stop. He thought about how love didn't arrive the way anyone told you it would. It didn't come in a single moment of clarity or a declaration or the perfect sentence. It came in the accumulation of ordinary evenings and difficult conversations and the slow discovery that someone's presence in your life had become structural. Not decorative, not convenient, but load-bearing. The kind you couldn't imagine removing without the whole thing shifting. He had built a life out of managed failures and small accommodations and the fierce protective love of a man who had decided that survival was enough. He had been wrong about the last part. Survival was the floor. It was not the ceiling. Isabella looked up from Lily's lecture on decomposition and caught his eye across the table, and she had the expression she got when she knew he was thinking something and was waiting to see whether he'd say it. He had told her once that she could always tell when he was inside something. She'd said, "Your face gets a certain kind of still." He reached across the table and took her hand. She turned it over and held it. Lily continued explaining the nitrogen cycle, pausing briefly to look at the joined hands with the evaluative expression of a 6-year-old conducting an ongoing assessment, and then apparently concluding that the situation remained in compliance with her standards, turned back to her notes. Outside, the city moved in its ordinary way, indifferent and continuous, and full of people trying to build things that would last, and people trying to survive the night, and people carrying weight they didn't have to carry alone but hadn't yet figured out how to put down. Some of them would figure it out. Some would find, as Ryan Carter had found, that the thing you spent years protecting yourself from was not the danger you'd imagined. That opening a door was not the same as losing a wall. That trust, extended carefully and to someone who deserved it, didn't cost you the self you'd worked to protect. It gave you a fuller version of it. Some would find that the world, despite its considerable evidence to the contrary, occasionally delivered exactly the right person to exactly the wrong road at exactly the right moment. Not because it was destined, not because the universe was arranged in anyone's favor, just because it happened. And because when it happened, they were paying attention. That was all it ever was. That was more than enough.